Episode 11, Britain versus France, or Why the US is more French than it likes to admit. This episode is dedicated to Rich Hopkins, Jerome Rock, Glenn Richards, and Richard de Legally. A year ago, I got this question thanks to some prompts from social media, and oddly enough, a stroll along the Ninth Bridge, or the Pont Neuf, crossing the River Seine, going back a few years. It's a question of why is the US more French than British? Obviously, it's not just about driving on the right side of the road, as I tried to explain in the baseball versus crickets episode. Well, let's compare the British versus the French. Look at the British. Think about their foods. Starting from desserts backwards, think about the term spotted dick. That's right, spotted dick with raisins. You can see an example of this in the movie called King Ralph with John Goodman and, believe it or not, Peter O'Toole. It's actually a really good dessert. It was a movie that was produced in 1991. Can you find anything like this in America? It's a spotted dick. Hey, what would you like for dessert? A spotted dick? And then teas and scones. 4 o'clock, 3 or 4 o'clock, sometime in the afternoon. There's always a reason for having tea. Can you find this in America somewhere? That's a tough call. About the only think about the term tea in the Sahara was clearly sung by a British person, Sting, or aka Gordon Sumner. If you want to think about foods, British foods that's become more popular in America, they tend to be more Irish. Think about bangers and mash, as well as vegetable boxty. And does shepherd's pie count here? That's really a question for a debate between the Scots and the Irish. And speaking of the Scottish, think about haggis. Okay. First of all, haggis, it's not bad. It's an acquired taste, to say the least. As long as you can just get over all the different things that are actually ground, mashed up together with oats to make this big ball. Yeah, you need a lot of whiskey with it. Some of the most notable food types that you find in Britain they tend to be imported from elsewhere, such as excellent curry that you find in the Whitechapel district of London. When you hop in the tube, just look for go to the stop that says Whitechapel district, and also Wagamamas in London. After all, empires, they maintain their natural resources by depleting resources and also cultural appropriations at times from elsewhere. Language. Think about all the musicians, not all, most of the musicians and actors coming from Britain. When they're making money, when they're in a movie, do they speak like British? I'm sure for the BBC as well as for the Sky One crowd, they do. But for the American audiences, think about Damian Lewis in the series Band of Brothers. The dude's he's British, no question about it. As well as in, let's see, did he absolutely sound like a British person in the series? No, he definitely sounded probably more like Richard or Dick Winters. What can I say? I'm sure the British people who make money making music or making movies, they clearly tell people, hey, I'm not American, but hey, 20 pounds is at least 20 pounds. And you have a lot more passive language versus active language, which means rather than saying, I did this, then you have henceforth, whilst, therefore. I guess they need to fill up their writing spaces one way or the other. And then let's look at their government. It's a parliament. It's so you can find different YouTube series out there that explains how parliament works in the British in the British colonies as well as in Britain proper, and it goes on for hours. It's really the parliament, the government, that keeps the monarchy rich through taxation, and you need majority, so it's majority votes necessary to get things done. And believe it or not, it's actually the monarchy. Technically, it was a queen, now it's the king, must approve the prime minister's proposals for anything, which is historically has been a formality, like a rubber stamping kind of a function, if you will. And let's face it, it's a bicameral form of a government system. When you look at Parliament, you got the House of Commons, and then you got the Lords. What's up with this Lords thing? And this government, even though this government survived World War II because of sort of great contributions from its people, it did chemically castrate one of its national heroes, Alan Turing. That's right, Alan Turing, the man behind the Turing test. Going back into language, going back into music, as far as think about it, when was the last time you picked up a British musical instrument to play anything in America? Aside from wall basses, which it was popularized by Geddy Lee, the bass player for the Canadian band, yes, Canadian, Rush. It's really the American guitars and basses, i.e. the Washburn N4, that rules the import circuit. But there's an exception to this. Giving credit to the Irish, the emerald carbon fiber guitars that are made in Ireland, they're made really well, and they do compete sonically, orally, really well with the Adamas synthetic guitars. Synthetic means carbon fiber. And think about how the musicians in Britain typically record their music. They really don't use their natural accent. There are some exceptions, such as the Proclaimers, famous for the album called Sunshine on Leith, made popular in America because of the movie called Benny and June, I'm Gonna Be 500 Miles. You listen to the entire album, it's their native Scottish dialect. Even this, it is so, they take great pride in their Scottish dialect to the point where you listen to the song I'm Gonna Be 500 Miles, they even use Scottish vocabulary such as havering. I'm going to be havering to you, haver, which means to talk rubbish in old Scots word, or it's a Scots language, if you will. And then you also have bagpipes. Scottish music and bagpipes, it's pretty well known all around the world. You go to some colleges, such as Westmont College in Santa Barbara, these graduation processionals are, you often have a bagpipe player. It's pretty loud and it's unique, and and the British, they take great pride in the bagpipes. One great example of this, Right Said Fred. That's right, the band famous for the song "I'm Too Sexy." Listen to their song called "You're My Mate," and I will stand by you. Listen for the bagpipe segments. Let's look at the British movies / TV series. Look at BBC. BBC has more quality and consistency with respect to what they produce for the market, and this is helped by the fact that the British TV tax that all TV owners have to pay helps to relieve some financial pressures with respect to what BBC and Sky One has to face. This basically helps to explain why BBC has successfully exported a few series such as Fawlty Towers, Red Dwarf, Doc Martin, and Monty Python Anything to the outside world. There's also BBC Ireland too, look up a series called Ballycus Angel, as well as a BBC Scotland a series called Monarch of the Glen. And with respect to some movies, there were some British movies that were really well exported, remade for the American audience. Get Carter, which was originally with Michael Caine and Sylvester Stallone, and later on was made with Sylvester Stallone. Lawrence of Arabia, Peter O'Toole. That movie was just made famous without having to be remade for the American market. And then the original Italian Job with Noel Coward, as well as Michael Caine, remade for the American market with, Charlize Theron and Mark Wahlberg, as well as who played the bad guy? Edward Norton. That's it. Look at cars, vehicles, automobiles. Yes, the British are famous for Jaguar, the Rover Cooper, the original Rover Cooper. Although these days, the modern day Mini Cooper version, it's practically a BMW in terms of maintenance costs. BMW apparently stands for big money wasted, as well as Bentley and Land Rover. Aren't these companies now owned by other companies that belong outside of Britain? And how popular are these brands in the United States? Wine. Let's look at alcohol. Wine. No, I'm sorry, I can't really help you with this. Beer. All right, this is where the British, especially with their room temperature or cellar temperature ales galore, Never, let's never mind Guinness, never mind Murphy's. You go to, you can't. It's very hard to replicate ales the way that's the way the British do it, especially with, let's see, especially with their waters coming from Burton-on-Trent. It has just the right amount of calcium, has the right amount of hardness, just to give the beers a certain amount of good amount of creaminess and bite. And then also look at ciders. What other countries in the world do a better job with respect to making really good ciders? Here's an example. Say in Britain, go to Weston's in Britain, and look up their cider collections, especially the vintage one. It's worth the pounds. Let's look at liquors. Think about liquors. What are some great examples of British liquors that that clearly stand out to you? Well, you also have London Dry Gin. Although I'd have to argue that Rogue Spruce Gin, coming from Rogue out of Oregon, yeah, I'll spend dollars on that. And then you also have Scottish whiskey, as well as Irish whiskey too. That's a tough call because Yamazaki clearly has these British whiskeys beat. And then let's look at sports. Oh yes, you got cricket and football. Okay, club or association football, not gridiron football. Those are two different things. That's right, the other football. Let's look at France. French foods. Okay, so with respect to French foods, they really have mastered the sauces. We're talking about, let's see, woody sauces, or called sauce Madeira. Let's see, which is, well, you'll just have, you know what, just go find a book called the Joy Cooking Book, and the recipe, it explains the history really well. So basically, butter and sauces, anything. Think about it. Escargot, steamed, cooked, snails. Hey, you know what? If the butter and the sauce is great, let's try some. Cheeses, or in French, le fromage. If it's a choice between French cheeses, where you have, if you were to go to, let's say, Le Bon Marché in, let's say, in Paris. Now, granted, Paris doesn't represent the rest of France. You go there, and you're able to find a whole bunch of different cheeses, whether it's just white cheese, whether it's cheese that has truffles mixed into it. Let's see, smelly cheeses, soft cheeses, the variety. They have the standard for everybody else to follow. And even some people from Wisconsin would admit to this, definitely. But that's a tough call, because when you look at cheeses that we're famous for, especially from Wisconsin, that part of the Midwest, cheese curds, because the cheese curds are a precursor for poutine. And then the French, they also specialize in using almost every part of the animal. Think about French, let's see, black pudding or boudin, which is basically blood sausages, and how it's similar to our chitlins here. And think about, let's see, the pastry called croissants. Croissants are definitely more popular in the US compared to scones. Think about this. If you were to go to a fast food restaurant, let's see, let's say McDonald's, you have a biscuit. You go to Burger King, what do you got there? Do you have a scone for that's used as the basis for the breakfast meal? No, it's a croissant. Okay, there's a bunch of people back in France who are probably screaming like little schoolgirls at this point over this heresy. Hey, you know what? Burger King, they're popular for a reason. Language. Let's think. If you think about the French language, it's been more ubiquitous than the British form of English. It used to be the official language of diplomacy. Used to, not anymore. Think about it. Dr. Ben Franklin, that's right, of the Lightning ilk, he spoke French. The Russian Tsars, I think all the way up to the Romanovs, they learned French. And even some of their literary people, I want to say Tolstoy, wrote War and Peace, part of it, in French. It's also the other official language of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Although from a working point of view, when you have more French people who are assigned to NATO, who speak English than you do more Americans as well as British who learn French, there's a sign. And the language, it also sounds very pretty in artistic terms, if you will, compared to German. Think about it. Butterfly. In Spanish, mariposa. In French, papillon. And in German, Schmetterling. By the way, in Norwegian, it's Sommerfugel. And the language is also governed, in terms of how the language is supposed to be used, it's governed by National Institute called Institut de la France. I want to say it's in the 7th district, 7th arrondissement of Paris, France. Look at the government, too. Let's think about the government, too. It's a lot like the US. I know it sounds strange because the French, they used to have a monarchy, but think about what happened to the monarchy. King Louis, I want to say the 16th or something like that. Marie Antoinette, let them, the lady who's famous for saying, let them who want to eat cake, let them have, eat cake, right? Well, off with their heads, thanks to the Reign of Terror. And then Napoleon came along, and then you had a whole bunch of Napoleonic codes, modernization, and then the French, they essentially decided to adopt more of a representative form of government, which is why they don't have a prime minister, they have a president. Think about the music. It's really hard to find, it's very difficult to find French music that's really prominent in American music, unless if the music is being recorded either for a French audience, or it just happens to work for some offbeat reason. Jack Johnson, I believe he was one of his songs called Banana Medley, had a little bit of French in it. And then let's not forget Patti LaBelle with Lady Marmalade, or in Madame or Mademoiselle Marmalade. Close. But the French, they also do a good job of also being a former empire, because what's the name for France in German? Frankreich. Or the French realm, or the French Empire, or something like that. They don't really have goth music as being part of their culture, so they essentially import it. And here's an example: The Cure, Robert Smith. By Robert Smith's own admission, he found his band to be more popular in France than in England, because the French, they didn't really have their own equivalent goth music, so they just ended up just clinging on to the Cure music. Let's look at movie/TV. I would say there's more movies than British movies that get remade for the American audience, remade for Hollywood. Think about Taxi, that was remade with, Queen Latifah as the driver, yes, as well as another movie called L'Intouchable, or The Untouchables, the American version being made with Gerard Butler. And the list goes on from there. Cars. This is where the British clearly have the French beat. There's really the French have no luck getting these things sold in the US. There's too many safety things to account for, such as having to add more weights, more metal structures to meet as National Highway Transportation and Administration regulatory requirements basically keeps French cars such as Peugeot out of the American market. And it's quite a shame, because Peugeot, it's fun to drive. Wine. Let's go into the alcohol section. The fact that you have better wine selections in France than you do in Britain, for example. Well, let's see, Bordeaux, Chardonnay. When you have majority of the wine names being in French languages, even with these names being used for grapes and wines that are produced in California. But speaking of California, California wines once in a while do a better job, tasting better than French wines. And for my French colleagues out there who are probably screaming again because you're hearing heresy, look for a movie with Bill Pullman called Bottle Shock. Beer, French beer, I can't say I've had much luck with this. French liquors? Well, the French really don't have liquors the way we think of liquors. They essentially have something that's a bit more fortified or concentrated, such as Lillet Rosé, Lillet Blanc, with different kinds of herbs mixed into it. But they have taken different concepts from a foreign country, such as Britain, taken a gin, and added their own spin to it. For example, saffron infused gin. Oh yeah. Sports. Well, this is where I'm sure cricket is somewhat popular in certain parts of France, maybe around Normandy, but it's mostly soccer. So when you look at these two countries, Britain versus France, how are they similar to each other? There's a bunch of academics who've probably written articles on the or theses on these topic, and great. Generally speaking, these were former empires, which means that they essentially depleted natural resources from elsewhere, which meant that they essentially maintained their own natural resources by causing natural resource depletion from elsewhere, as to paraphrase or quote from Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. And they also imported what they wanted from elsewhere too. Some of the best Moroccan foods you'll ever find in Europe are in Paris, whereas for good curry, as well as for good samosa, and also for a really good bowl of vegetable khichdi, if you're really starved, England. What sets these countries apart from each other? Well, generally speaking, at the 50,000-foot level, they each drive on the wrong side of the road, depending on if you're a fan of Napoleon or if you're a fan of Duke of Wellington. France is a republic, whereas Britain, even though it functions like a representative form of a government, technically speaking, it is a monarchy, because the Queen, now the King, still gives a stamp of approval with respect to whatever bright idea the Prime Minister brings to the monarchy on behalf of Parliament. Foods? Yes. There's a big difference between the British and French foods. Distilled spirits? Yep, the Japanese definitely have both countries beat, especially with the Yamazaki whiskey, as well as with the Roku gin too. So going back to the original question, why is it, first of all, is it true that the US is more French than British? Well, just as I explained in the first episode, baseball versus cricket, we drive on the right side of the road, just like the French, and our language seems to evolve or sometimes devolve depending on your point of view with respect to how fancy or how creative our vocabulary gets, such as Rachel Ray's famous for what's that phrase? Look for that word. Fantabulous. Right? And then famous chefs, do they go to England or do they go to France to master their craft? Go talk to Gordon Ramsay. And then for historical risks, let's go back to history for a little bit. There are more French generals that were in the United States Continental Army, which sort of makes sense. It's sort of like a default kind of a thing, because think about it. The Americans, they declared independence from Britain, so I'm sure that the British declared the Americans to be outlaws, so therefore Parliament revoked all their British citizenship. So by default, if you have one French general / admiral in the Continental Army, then the continental United States is definitely more French than it is British. And if you don't believe me, look up these names: Louis Antoine Jean Lebec de Pless Dupotel. I hope I didn't butcher that too badly. Mathias Alexis Roche de Fermoy, Joachim von Robert, Baron de Kalb. These are such long names. Why did they come up with such long titles in the first place? It must be one of those monarchy or hereditary title kinds of things. Jean Armand Tiffon, Marquis de la Rue, as well as Gilbert de Motier, Marquis de la Lafayette, who, by the way, is buried in the Cimetière Picpus in Paris, France, and it's the only cemetery in Paris to consistently have the American flag and American decoration on the site at all times, thanks to the Daughters of the American Revolution. Vive la France. All right, now for the Kevin Bacon game. Thanks to the Normans and the 1066 AD Anno Domini Battle of Hastings, by those 2 degrees of separation, the British and the Americans literally owe their linguistic heritage to the French. Henceforth, vive la France. Thanks. Until next time.